So let's start with the sentence. This sentence is interesting to me because after the comma, I would have expected a participle, like I saw Teddy Ann stand there, comma, grinning at him or staring at him. But because this word is missing, the sentence seems kind of strange, almost doesn't make sense, but it still kind of does. Now, imagine a novel that is just filled with these kinds of excisions, not just at the sentence level, but also at the paragraph level, at the page level, at the chapter level. And such a work exists. It's called The Red Truck. It's by Rudy Wilson. This book was published in 1987 by Knopf. It's a quick read. It's 178 pages long, and it's known. The author acknowledges that this book was originally more than double its length, but was pared down by him and his editor. His editor was Gordon Lish, who is pretty well known at this point for paring down writers' works, sometimes even adding in sentences of his own. But in this case, it was just pure excision. And this book has all the hallmarks of that type of collaboration. You know, it's very short sentences, short chapters, short paragraphs, and with the vocabulary of, like, I guess, a third grade reading proficiency, it's still pretty difficult. It's a difficult work to get through. Also with how this book is structured. But this book it takes place in the early 50s in Mississippi or somewhere in the Deep South, and concerns a character named Billy Jump, who goes through a lot of traumatic stuff in his childhood. He, in the beginning, just the first couple pages, he's accidentally trapped inside of an icebox on his neighbor's property with his younger brother Ned. I think Billy's about 7.5 years old and Ned's 6 at the time. And they suffocate in this icebox, and Ned passes away. Billy survives out of his coma, and he has this tremendous sense of guilt at what happened. So he kind of grows in a stunted way, and also his grandmother passes away not too long after that. So he's definitely sort of damaged in a way as he's growing up. You know, this character goes inside himself a lot. He becomes introverted, and then he becomes obsessed with this idea of a girl that to him exists. And I guess she's sort of a savior figure for him. He even keeps like a little doll that represents her in his pocket. So the first third of the book is him growing up, and then the book takes a radical departure and goes back into the past, Civil War era, and concerns a whole other family who is basically attacked by a group of rebels, murdered. You know, there's mother, father, some children, and it's a pretty gruesome chapter here. Really reminds me of, you know, early Brian Evenson or Cormac McCarthy. There's like, I don't know, decapitation and necrophilia, and one of the characters survives, and that's a boy named Adele, who the rebels spare him because, you know, he's obviously like addled, and they consider him special and holy, and that it would be a bad omen to kill such a person. I guess he's sort of like a Christ-like figure. Then, after that chapter, it just jumps. I love how this book jumps in time. It goes forward into 1960 and talks about this character named Teddy Ann. Teddy Ann is a girl. I guess she's about 8 years old, and she too has a traumatic childhood, just like Billy Jump. In her case, she witnessed her brother Charles fall from a tree, and he died. She also kind of fell off from a really high place and injured herself. So there's some of that trauma going on too with her. She also grows up kind of stunted. Now, these two characters eventually meet. They're just destined to meet, and yeah, there's also a lot of references to this red truck, and in this sort of like dreamlike childhood phase these kids are going through, they start confusing objects and images, and for her, this red truck represents Christ. Then the book just jumps from Teddy Ann's perspective back over to Billy's perspective, and there's a jump in time as well. It's 1968, and Billy is 23 years old, and as you're reading, you kind of get a sense of what happens. I mean, this writer doesn't explicitly give you everything as you're reading. You really have to be alert, otherwise some of the details will just pass you by. But apparently he's 23. He'd spent the last 3 years in prison for injuring a man who seems to have done something to a girl that he was involved with named Suzanne, and he blinded that man. He ended up going to prison. He just got out of prison, and he's wandering around, hitches a ride, and ends up in a town called Cuba in Mississippi. And that's when these two characters meet. The chapters start splitting their perspective. So sometimes it's narrated by Teddy Ann, sometimes by Billy. Teddy Ann takes a liking to Billy right away. She recognizes that he's a lost character, kind of like herself, and they get involved. She's only 16 at the time, but it seems like these two characters are each other's soulmates, and they get to know each other, and it becomes erotic and sexual, and it looks like they're both going to experience happiness finally. And she shows him around her town. He shows her around his town back home, and he introduces her to his parents and his ex-girlfriend Suzanne, who seems to have become this manic depressive character who does self-harm. And she's got a brother whose name is Lee, and he seems pretty addled as well. There's a couple of these like special characters in the book, and it's sort of hinted that Lee is a reincarnation of the survivor from that Civil War attack, the boy named Adele. And yeah, that's kind of cool how this author does that. It really reminds me of what Steve Erickson does in some of his works, where there's historical flashbacks and the suggestion that some of these characters are reincarnations of each other. But yeah, and then this book ends with some tragedy, which happens so quick. But this book, yeah, it's just I think you have to read it 2 times to really get it to gel in your mind. I mean, the way the prose just doesn't hand everything to you. It gives you like maybe 60%, and then you have to bring the rest. Like, as you're reading, it's sort of like watching a bird fly, and then all of a sudden the bird just dives down or starts twirling around and doing something like completely without logic, but it still looks beautiful, and you're fascinated by it, but it's painful to watch. That's what reading this book felt like to me. I mean, it was such a raw, stripped down story, and each sentence, it just made whatever sentence or detail the author chose to focus on that much more important. And yet sometimes the sentences that he releases are just so simple, like childish observations, and so they're even more powerful as a result. And definitely the excision that takes place here, you can feel the ghosts of the other sentences that used to exist around what's left behind. You can feel that. You can feel that they were there and they're taken away, and there's this sort of like ghastly presence around, the remaining narrative here. Is this result? Is the structure like what the author had originally intended, or is this form that came about after the editing just the very best way to have told this story? I don't know, but there's definitely an amount of bravery that took place to have published the book in this form. I mean, for a writer to have his work cut in half is just already extremely painful, but then to release it as the final product, I guess where the credit falls doesn't really matter. The work, to me, was extremely effective, and I wouldn't really call it like a Southern Gothic. To me, it's kind of like a Southern grotesque, and it's not really that much of a Southern novel in how sparse it is, actually. I find a lot of Southern writers to kind of just do a lot of description, very prolix, kind of greasy prose, but this was so cut back, and as a result, so sharp, and all the details, everything was so sharp, and the structure of the book so delicate that I felt like I was trapped inside of a molecule of a hallucinogen. And if I moved around too much, the whole structure would threaten to just collapse in upon itself and cut me to pieces. So it's a very delicate read. But if you approach this work with a lot of focus, I think it'll really stay with you, especially if you go back and just kind of reread it, like maybe at 4 times the speed. It'll start to congeal in your mind, and it'll really stick with you, I think. The Red Truck by Rudy Wilson. Oh, here's the cover.